being objective. We first asked whether there are good objections to this idea, and we didn't find any. That, we said, doesn't settle anything. It might not be objective, it's just we haven't found a good reason to think so. Then we asked for reasons to think that it's objective. And I pointed out what Judith Jarvis Thompson said, that when we talk about disagreements about ethics and indecision about ethics, we mustn't overrate that. When you're talking about single moral considerations, single moral features, then there's very widespread agreement, I would say almost universal agreement, on what's correct and incorrect. Causing gratuitous pain that serves no moral purpose, is wrong. And that's not something which people debate and discuss and argue about and have different opinions or doubts about. Torturing small children for fun is simply wrong. Where we have disagreements is where there are conflicts between moral considerations, and then very often we don't know what to say, or we have different opinions, we don't know how to settle it. But that shouldn't obscure the fact that there's widespread agreement where it's only one moral consideration. That widespread agreement indicates that we're not just fishing in the dark, we're not just expressing our subjective points of view, because if we were doing that, then there shouldn't be any agreement at all. And then I pushed that idea further with everything up to there was, I think, well agreed upon. I pushed it further by saying that there's a limit to how much disagreement we will tolerate. When a person says something that is outrageous, obviously wrong, and he just says that's his opinion, that's how he thinks, that's what he holds, it's not possible to take that seriously. If he's confronted by overwhelming evidence that he's wrong, and he just says his opinion and doesn't take account of that overwhelming evidence, doesn't respond to that overwhelming evidence, then he's behaving in a patently unreasonable way. Our first refuge, if we want to take him seriously, is to say he probably doesn't mean what we mean. You're not using his words the way we use our words, and that's the way it goes in conversation. What do you mean by that? When do we say, what do you mean by that? We say that because if he meant what I hear, it's just ridiculous, because everybody knows it's wrong. So probably he means something else. That's the most charitable thing to do. And very often the person will say, well, I mean PQR. And you say to yourself, PQR, my gosh, I never dreamt that that's what he meant. Sure, that's why I asked him. Wonderful, now we can discuss the issue, because now I know what he meant, what he was talking about. If he continues to insist that he means what he said, and he means it the way we mean it, then we can't take him seriously. We simply say, you're joking, or you're insane, and conducting a conversation with you is ridiculous, because how do you conduct a conversation? How do you conduct an investigation? You do it by giving reasons for what you believe, or reasons against what the other guy believes. Where do the reasons come from? The reasons come from things on the ladder of obviousness. When you come to the highest level of obviousness, and the person just doesn't respond, at that point, there's no longer a discussion of reason. And he's on some other frequency, in which case you wish him well and go drink your tea or something. Just leave him alone. And there are some moral judgments which are on that highest level of reasonableness, where we don't need an appeal to anything else to settle them. They simply are as reasonable as anything else can be. Now, I said, that doesn't mean when you get to that top level of reasonableness that you're necessarily right. It doesn't mean you're necessarily right. It just means, given all the material in front of you, this is the reasonable position to take. And anybody who simply opts to ignore it is being unreasonable. There's another option, not to simply opt to ignore it, but to give a detailed explanation of why he rejects it. He would have to give a detailed explanation of why we think it's obviously wrong, what he's saying. And with that explanation, we should come to see that maybe we're making a mistake. And then he should present us with new evidence or new considerations which show that there's evidence on his side. If he does all of that, then indeed we will take seriously that this is an option we didn't think of, an option we didn't consider before, and we may learn to revise the opinions that we have at the top of the ladder. Having a ladder and having a top doesn't mean that you're stuck there, that you can't ever change your view, even about things that are on the top. But the way you change your view is by someone appealing to other things that are on the top and making a conflict between this thing that's on the top and those other things. And then when you face the conflict, you have to do something and you might change the original. But that's the way it's done. Short of that, he can't do it. That's why I say a person can't simply opt to disagree. There are no tables. There are no trees. 2 plus 2 is 7. That's not something that's open to simply opt to differ. You might have a whole story, but if you don't have a whole story, you can't do that. So, that being the case, I think there's good reason to take objectivity seriously. That doesn't prove that it is objective, but it's good reason to take it seriously. It certainly shouldn't be dismissed out of hand as superstitious, old-fashioned, out of date, refuted by more modern, enlightened philosophy. It simply is incorrect. And that being the case, I'm not inclined to back down from the position that morality is objective. That's more or less what we covered so far. Are we together on these matters? Yeah.
The ladder analogy, can you explain the criteria for what's at the top and the bottom?
The more obviously true a thing is, and the more widespread the agreement is on it, the higher up it is on the ladder.
Okay.
And you get to something which is obviously true to everybody. Chickens come from eggs. They don't land from the moon, and they don't grow out of the ground, and they don't born from grasshoppers, and so forth and so on. Chickens grow out of eggs. Somebody's going to deny that. He needs to tell a very special story. Because everybody knows that. Everybody knows that you see it. Everybody knows that it's obvious. He's got to tell a very special. He can't say, your opinion is that chickens come from eggs. I have a different opinion. I think chickens come from grasshoppers. He can't do that. If he just says that, he's classified himself as not being reasonable. And there's nothing left to do.
So why did you decide, I don't know whose analogy that is, but if it's yours, why would it be that's the top, not the bottom?
Oh, I don't know. I don't care about top and bottom. The question is, it's at the place of maximum strength for a reason.
Okay.
I don't care whether you call it top or bottom. Okay. That's not my issue. Okay, now somebody said, well, okay, you're talking about morality. What about truth? Relative truth. Now, usually people's attitude is much softer on morality than it is on truth. But there are people who discuss this. I once mentioned, I don't remember the example, but it was some statement either in the Upanishads or in the I Ching, one of the Eastern religious texts, and I said that it's false. And somebody said, Rabbi, when you say it's false, you mean it's Western false. It's Western false. But of course, this is an Eastern text. Why should it matter whether a statement in an Eastern text is Western false? It's just like, it's apples and oranges. Meaning, you have a concept of true and false. You're a child of the Western culture, and your concept is a Western concept. Western concepts apply to Western cultures because they're born from Western cultures. They're created in Western cultures. So that's what they apply to. You say that a statement in the Upanishads, the I Ching, is false, and you're using the Western concept of false. It's just no purchase. There's no connection. There's no reality to it. Now, I think that this type of reflection can be defeated by the same argument that I gave last time. But before we do that, I want to just give a little background. This idea that there's Western true and false and Eastern true and false, which means true and false are really relative concepts, they're not absolute concepts, not objective concepts, really subjective concepts. I think this attitude has a lot of demerits. Demerits even over and above the demerits of rejecting objective morality, and I think there are demerits that can be seen very easily. At the end, I'll come back to the arguments I was using against morality, but I think there are simpler and clearer arguments against the idea of relative truth. And here I'm back to things which everybody agrees on. That is, everybody who studies philosophy and writes philosophy agrees on this. Or almost everybody. The vast, vast majority. Let's imagine relative morality. Now, there's a society which believes that the earth is round, and therefore they believe that if you start at the equator and march 25,000 miles due west, you'll come back to where you started. There's another society that believes the earth is flat, and if you start at the equator and march 25,000 miles due west, you'll fall off the edge. Two societies, two beliefs, according to the relativist, two truths. Each society has its own truth. And each society's belief is true for it. Okay, now I'm going to try an experiment. I'm taking a member of each society, and I'm taking them with me to the equator, and we are going to march due west for 25,000 miles. Of course, the fellow who comes from the second culture doesn't want to go, but I've got a gun, so he's coming. Now we are going to march together 25,000 miles due west. What's going to happen? I'm asking the relativist, the guy who believes the truth is relative, what's going to happen? Will he say, oh, well, look, the guy who comes from the first society, who believes the earth is round and believes you go back to the point of origin, he will indeed go around and come back to the point of origin. And the guy from the second society, who believes that the earth is flat and will fall off the edge, he will fall off the edge. I think if the relativist says that, he's not worthy of further consideration. But then if he's going to say both will go around and come back to the point of origin, why is he giving preference to the first society and its concept of truth against the second society and its concept of truth? According to him, there's only this society's concept and that society's concept. How can he give preference to one over the other? I think this is a dilemma for the person who claims that truth is relative. I'll give you a second dilemma. In structure, it looks a little different, but I think it's based on the same fundamental idea. Sometimes we change our minds. That does happen to people. Okay, different times for different reasons, but sometimes we change our minds because we think that trading the old belief for a new belief puts us in a better position. Now, let's see how that works. I used to believe Q. If you like, my whole society used to believe Q. Whole societies change their minds about what they believe. My whole society used to believe Q. Okay? Now we've changed our minds, and we now all believe R. I want to ask the relativist, can you explain how it's possible to make any progress here? After all, when we all believed Q, Q was true for us, because that's our concept of truth, and that's what we accepted. Now we've changed Q for R, so R is now true for us, using our concept of truth. It's true for us. How does R have any profit over Q? Q was true for us, and now R is true for us. Is that progress? Have we bettered ourselves in any way? We had something that was true for us, now we have something that's true for us. The relativist can't explain why changing your mind should ever improve your position. We think we're improving our position because we think, with long experience living with Q, we come up against some problems. Q doesn't always work and doesn't fit and comes to conflict with other things, and we move to R with less conflict, better fit with what we experience. We think we're getting something that's more true than before. But the relativist can't say it's more true because that appeals to an objective sense of truth. So I think that the relativist is in a dilemma here. He can't give any account of the expedition at the equator, and he can't give any account of changing your mind. There's a third simple demerit to relative truth. I'll just give 90 seconds of background. The 20th century saw widespread implementation of an idea that goes back to the Greeks. If you have a principle that's supposed to be a real general principle, try applying the principle to itself and see what you get. Put the principle in the field of its own application and see what you get. Often you get very disturbing results. Here's a simple example. All rules have exceptions. Nothing's perfect, right? People make mistakes. People can't anticipate what the future will show. All rules have exceptions. No rule is really universally correct. All rules have exceptions. Okay, let's try. All rules have exceptions, including that one? How about that one? Isn't all rules have exceptions a rule? Sounds like a rule. It's a general statement. So let's see. If all rules have exceptions is true, then that statement itself has to have an exception. Now it's getting twisted, hey? Let's try it slowly. What would an exception be to the rule that all rules have exceptions? What would an exception to that be? It would be a rule that has no exceptions. So if I really believe all rules have exceptions, I've got to acknowledge that there's at least one rule that doesn't have exceptions, which means that what I believed was false. This rule contradicts itself. It contradicts itself. That's not a good position for a rule to be in. It's kind of self-defeating, you know. Say something, it turns out that if you're right, you're wrong, then I guess you're wrong. Because there's no other option. Because if you're wrong for sure. And if you're right, you're wrong, so then you're stuck being wrong. Now, this 20th century used this trick over and over again. Let's try it here. Here we have a universal rule. The rule is all truth is relative. All truth is relative. Let's try to apply that to itself. All truth is relative, even the truth of that statement is relative. Okay, now I think here the believer in relative truth is caught in a dilemma. It's a little bit of a sensitive dilemma. It needs a little subtle consideration. And I could imagine a relativist who could escape the dilemma, but I think it's a pretty serious dilemma. Let's say he wants to be consistent. Okay, all truth is relative. Even that one is also relative. Now, suppose then he's confronting a whole society that disagrees with him. They think that truth is objective. What can he say to them? Can he say they're wrong? On his grounds? On his grounds of relative truth, that's their society and that's their truth. Their truth is for them that truth is objective. He hasn't got anything to say to them. He can't attack them. He can't undermine them. He's got to credit them with having an acceptable position. Now, I suggest to you that the believers in relative truth don't act that way. They act as if they are hot in the grips of the latest modern thinking, and people who believe in objective truth are really mixed up or vicious imperialists who want to take over the world with their ideas and aren't tolerant of other people's differences and so on and so on. They think that people who believe in objective truth are vicious and wrong and should be condemned. But if he's a consistent relativist, he can't do that. Because according to him, their belief in objective truth is their truth. And it's just as good as his belief in relative truth. So I think the way relativists present themselves in discussion, in debate, in politics, is going to undermine their position. Okay, suppose he says, oh, I really love politics, and I really love criticizing the backwards, imperialists. So I'm going to do it this way. All truth is relative, except for this one. Except for this one. My overarching principle that all truth is relative, that one's really true. That one's really objectively true, and everything else is relative. I think at that point, his position lacks motivation. Why would this one be the only exception? Where does a concept of objective truth come from? If I have a concept of objective truth that's available for this one, what makes you think it's not available for other things as well? I think the burden of proof is on you now to explain why this is different from everything else. And they never do that, because that's a good reason. I don't think it could be done. At any rate, applying the rule, all truth is relative, to itself leads to a dilemma for the relativist. So now I think we have simple, short, concrete reasons to object. Relativism, the trip at the equator, the inability to account for progress when you change your mind, and the fact that when you apply it to itself, you get an unacceptable description of what's going on. And again, none of this is original. All of this is in the literature, and it's well agreed upon. Now, in addition to all of that, I'll come back to the kind of argument that I used before with respect to morality and show you how it applies here. What I'm going to say now is not so uncontroversial. There is controversy about this. Some people wouldn't agree with me. They're just wrong. And here's how it goes. Go back to that student who, when I criticized, well, I didn't criticize, I just said there's some things in the Upanishads, the I Ching, that are false, and he said, false? Give me Western false. right? Because you're from the West, and who cares whether an Eastern religious tract is Western false? It's apples and oranges, just doesn't matter. What I want to say is this: T-R-U-E is my word. I own it. I own the concept. The Western world created the word and the concept, and if anybody else wants to use it, they'd better agree with our concept. If they don't agree with our concept, they have no right to the word. I cannot say, you have your concept of truth, but in the East, there's a different concept of truth. In the East, truth means whatever the king says. That's not another concept of truth. That's not truth. It's something else. It's what the king says. Now, it may be that in the East, they don't care about truth. That's fine. That's fine. Nobody says you have to care about truth. I think it's a fantasy, but I don't mind if they dismiss truth, if they have no interest in truth, no use for truth. That's fine with me. Just to claim that it's another concept of truth has boundaries. If it crosses the boundaries, then it isn't another concept of truth. It's something else. Give me just 3 more minutes to elaborate this one. I'm happy to discuss it. Think back to what we said about translation. If you're translating somebody else's language, and he says gobbledygook, gobbledygook, and according to your translation, it comes out to something that's obviously ridiculous. You don't say, I've discovered a tribe that believes obviously ridiculous things. What you say is, my translation is wrong. My dictionary is wrong. He says, according to your translation, it's true that every whole number is smaller than 3. Every whole number is smaller than 3. Something's going wrong. Either you got whole wrong or number wrong, or you got true wrong. Because that's just, obviously, he knows about numbers. He knows smaller and bigger. He's good at that. He can't mean every whole number is smaller than 3. And it could be that we've gotten truth wrong. If he says truth means whatever the chief says, we know that isn't what it means. That's anything close to what it means. So then it can't mean truth. He could mean what's productive is what the chief says, or what will get you in good, higher in politics is what the chief says, or you'll get into the world to come because the chief runs the entry portal to the world to come. That it could mean, but true it can't mean because it's just too far out. So one cannot appeal to Eastern truth to protect the statements in the Upanishads and the I Ching. If they are false, false means Western, false. To put the Western in is redundant. F-A-L-S-E is our word, our concept. We're applying it. And as I said, it could be that in their scriptures, they don't care about what we call true and false. Indeed, I read one account of Confucianist philosophy where it talked about revolutions in their beliefs, and it said the way they arrived at the beliefs of their religions was to ask, if we believe X, will that help society? Will it help the economy? Will it help interpersonal relations or not? If it does, we believe it. If it doesn't, we don't. That means the way they decide what to believe has nothing to do with truth. They don't care whether it's true or not. They just don't care. That's fine. I have no critique of such a society. Maybe I could, but I'm not pushing that horse at the present moment. All I'm pointing out is you can't call that Eastern truth. What you call that is an attitude which doesn't use truth as a criterion. Your question?
I was just wondering what the definition of emet is and how it differs to our definition of truth.
Oh, that's a deep, deep question. I have a whole hour's share on that. Emet does not mean truth. Not mean truth. It means something else which overlaps with truth to a certain extent, but it does not mean truth. Rav Dessler has a whole essay on this. I have a whole hour's share on it, and it is on my tape shiurim. And on my website, there's a button called Lectures where I have outlines of my shiurim, and there you can get the sources for it. It's a long. MS means something like what is ultimately real and eternal.
Does that imply then that difference in definition that for somebody like in my position or in other people's at this yeshiva's position, that when we're embarking on this Baal Tshuva journey or becoming more religious, then we must sort of learn that definition of emet first and then immerse ourselves in that, or is it will suffice to?
No. See, this is very good. I'm glad you asked this. This is a very good example of what I'm talking about. What I said before is that emes doesn't mean truth. It doesn't mean truth. It means something else. It's not an alternative definition of truth or an alternative concept of truth. It doesn't mean truth at all. It means something else. Now, it would be very important to learn the concept of emes and learn how to use that concept also.
Is there a Hebrew equivalent for what we call truth?
I don't know whether there's something, how far back it goes. Nachon in Hebrew, in present-day Hebrew, Nachon would be close to true.
And then when we'd say 2 plus 2 is 4 is nachon.
Right. In present-day Hebrew, you would say that. In present-day Hebrew, they would say emes because they're not sensitive to the nuances that it has in the Tanakh. In the Tanakh, emes is a quality of actions. It's a quality of actions. Actions are not true and false. The minute you see that the use of emes over and over again in the Tanakh to describe actions, you know that's not true and false. It's something else. Yeah.
This is not directly on the topic of your current points, but on the topic of your morality. And I would like to, if you don't want to deal with it now, deal with it at some point during this section. There's a very commonly held belief among Jewish people that there is no morality without Torah. And I got into a debate with the rabbi on Thursday night who brought this up, and I asked him if he'd ever met you because I felt like this particular lecture contradicts that. And I'd like to hear your response to that.
I think you could try out for prophecy, because I didn't really talk about that directly, but you are entirely correct. You're entirely correct. I believe that the position that there's no morality without God, or at least without God's commands, that's God's commands that create right and wrong. I think it's wrong. It's wrong philosophically, and it's wrong Jewishly. I have more than a dozen sources that show it's wrong Jewishly. When rabbis bring this up, and this is in certain books that are addressed to the beginning public, all those books that deal with this question have one thing in common: no footnotes. Because there are no Jewish sources that take that position. And indeed, there are many Jewish sources that take the opposite position. And if you like, we can discuss this at length. Usually what I've done now about objective truth comes at the end after that discussion. But I'm happy to do that discussion because I think that is it's a terrible mistake.
You know, I think that you're plainly correct. But it's a debate that I've often found myself getting into with religious people, the religious
100%.
part of the faith. And it would be nice to have someone who's considered an authority on religion like yourself to say that you agree with me as well. So I'm not just coming from a non-religious.
I agree with you 100%. The position that God's command creates what's right and wrong. Without God's command, nothing is really right or wrong. That position is simple, clear, intuitive, convincing, useful because you can beat up the atheist with it. You don't really have values, right? It only has one demerit: it's wrong. And the truth is subtle and complicated and so on. It has one merit, and that is it's true. And I'm happy to do that at length. So let's finish with objectivity of truth, and then but you're 100% right. It's definitely worth doing. So are we together about the objectivity of truth? All the arguments applied, I added arguments today, and the argument from before applies. The idea that there are different concepts of truth and all the rest of that is just a non-starter. With morality, it's not a non-starter, and I gave you indications you could take the objectivity of morality seriously. I didn't go any further than that. Relativity of truth is a non-starter. It's a non-starter. Okay, so if that's the case, let's start to work on this issue. The position we are considering has two halves. One half is, if God doesn't say anything, if God doesn't command anything, nothing's really right or wrong. Maybe you've heard the famous quote from Dostoevsky, "If there is no God, then everything is permissible." That's supposed to express this idea. Of course it doesn't. It's a mistake. What can you do? He was not a philosopher. He was only a writer. Permissible is also a moral term. What he should have said is, if there is no God, then there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no good, there's no evil, there's no permissible and impermissible. All moral terms are vacuous. They don't apply at all. That's what he should have said, if he had been a little more clear-headed. That's one half of the position, the negative half. The other half of the position is, when God commands it, that makes it so. When God commands it, it becomes morally right, good, just. If he forbids it, it becomes wrong, bad, unjust. Both halves are wrong. One half is wrong, I think, directly, and the other half is without foundation. And as I said, the truth is more complicated. Let's start with the negative arguments. this is similar to what we've already done. Let's start with the half that says, without God's command, nothing's really right or wrong. This I can do quickly because we really did it already in detail. I want to put the burden of proof on the person who believes that. That's his position. He holds it. He represents it. Okay, back it up. Without God's command, there's no real right or wrong. Well, we went through that at great length. We said, give me a reason to think that morality is relative. And we couldn't find one. He's saying something more narrow. If there isn't a God, then morality is relative. Fine. I raised the question without even that premise. Show me a good reason for thinking that morality is relative. Now, here's a good spot to illustrate what I was trying to protect against in terms of shifting the burden of proof. The argument about this goes the following way, almost all the time. I believe in objective morality, and he believes in relative morality. So I say to him, tell me why you believe in relative morality. Show me what your reasons are. He goes through one after another, and they aren't adequate. And then he says to me, well, prove it's objective. That's a foul. He has no right to that. What we ought to do is call a halt one step before and say, okay, you've run out of reasons. None of the reasons work. Let's just stop to catalog the present condition. You have no reason for thinking it's relative, right? You have no reason for thinking that. So you ought to at least now admit that you don't know any better than we do, and you're as much in doubt about the issue as we are. It might be relative, but you have no reason for saying so. So you don't know whether it's relative or not. That's very substantial progress. And that applies to the guy who takes the negative position with respect to God. If there is no God, it's all relative. I want to hear why you say that. As we saw last time, there's no good reason to say that. So that part is simply without foundation. It's just assumed without foundation. And frankly, you can't beat up at somebody with your assumptions. Okay, now let's try it the other way. Let's try the positive side. Well, if God commands it, that makes it right, good, just, and so forth and so on. Obligatory. Let's ask, how does that work exactly? God commanded it, and therefore it becomes right, good, obligatory, just. What is it about God that guarantees that when he commands it, it becomes moral? How does that connection made? Let's try some candidates. Is it because God is all-powerful? God's all-powerful. He could do anything. So when he says it's right, it becomes right. There's no relationship between power and morality. The stronger people are more moral because they're stronger. Typically, the stronger people are less moral because they're strong. Right? There's no relationship between strength and morality. Let's say all-knowing, because he knows everything. Therefore, when he says it's right, it becomes right. No connection between knowledge and saying it's right, making it right. The only candidate that fits, and there is one, but it undermines the argument at issue. The only candidate that fits is when God says it's right, it becomes right because he is morally perfect. If he's morally perfect, then when he says it's right, it becomes right. That's fine. But notice, to make that work, you've got to judge that he's morally perfect before you get his command on the table. That's already a moral judgment. The proposition we're considering is God's command creates morality. If he hasn't commanded anything yet, there is no morality. If there is no morality prior to his commands, then I can't have on board a proposition that he's morally perfect, because there's no morality yet. So the idea that God's commands create morality is incompetent. It can't be made to work. So both halves of the standard position that God's commands create morality, the negative half and the positive half, are mistaken. Now, in addition to that, we have many Jewish sources that state this directly and forcefully. God tells Abraham, I've had it with Sodom and Gomorrah. I've had it. If the report that I've gotten, so to speak, is true, that's it. I'm wiping them out. Abraham says a few things to God. One of the things he says is, you can't kill the righteous together with the wicked. You can't do that. It's not just. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Seems to me, according to the position we are considering, God should have answered Abraham, Abraham, you just missed it. Go back, take Philosophy 101 again, and learn it from the ground up. I am morality. I am morality. I create morality. I make it. If I do it, it's moral because I am who I am. Look it up in the dictionary. God is the source of morality, period. How can you accuse me of doing something unjust? It's backwards. But Abraham does accuse him. And God doesn't say it's a mistake. The contrary, God said, of course I'm not going to kill the righteous. That wasn't in the proposition in the first place. The Talmud says there's such a thing called, one class of mitzvahs are called mishpatim. Mishpatim, says the Talmud, are things which we would know we must do, even if they were never commanded. How can you know that if we were never commanded? How did it become right or wrong? Maimonides says in the guide that if there's something which logic tells you is good and you do it, God will reward you. And if logic tells you it's bad, God will punish you, even if it was not commanded by any prophet. Those are his words. Which means, given your own logic, you're supposed to be able to tell what's right and what's wrong, within limits, as we'll see, but you're supposed to be able to tell that. Maimonides says in the Mishnah Torah, in his legal work, that man has the ability to know from himself, from his own mind, what's right and what's wrong. He says on the basis of a verse in Genesis. The verse says, the normal translation is, behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Maimonides' translation is, to put a comma in one word before, behold, man has become unique. He's become unique. Mimenu ladas tov v'ra, knowing from himself good and evil. Knowing it from himself, that's what he translates and explains it. And if you are dealing with people with academic prejudices, deep, common academic prejudices, you can point out to them that Unclus, in his Aramaic translation 1,000 years before, translates the same way. And Unclus wasn't a medieval Spanish philosopher. Unclus was a Roman convert. So this is just 3 of a dozen places where, and I'll go through more of them next time, where the Torah is online, is on record, that you can know what's right or wrong without God's command. And that being the case, this position cannot be correct. Now, I'll give you more cases next time, and also, we then have to do the positive job. Okay, if so, how do morality and God's commands relate to one another? They can't be just disconnected. And they aren't just disconnected. Quick.
If there's this idea that we should be able to understand what's right and what's wrong, something's right and wrong logically, would the commandments that Hashem gives be the ones we can't understand logically?
No, it's a good question. It's a good question. This needs a lot more work. We'll do it next time, tomorrow.